The lights in the studio were bright, and the crowd was buzzing with excitement. Everyone had gathered for the filming of one of the most popular late-night talk shows. The host was known for his sharp humor, quick wit, and sometimes cutting remarks. Many guests in the past had laughed nervously as he joked at their expense, but the audience often loved it. Tonight was expected to be one of the biggest episodes yet, because the guest of honor was none other than Keanu Reeves. As soon as Keanu's name was announced, the audience erupted in cheers and claps. People jumped to their feet, shouting his name and waving as he walked out. Dressed in his usual simple black suit with his long hair falling loosely around his face, Keanu gave a small smile, bowed slightly toward the audience, and waved. His calm energy filled the room immediately. Unlike many celebrities who arrived with exaggerated gestures or flashy clothes, Keanu's presence was gentle and almost humble, and that was exactly what made people love him so much. The host stood near his desk, clapping as Keanu walked over to take his seat. On the surface, it seemed like a normal show. The band played a few celebratory notes, the audience continued to cheer, and the cameras zoomed in on the smiling actor. Yet, just beneath the cheerful setup, there was a feeling that something might not go smoothly. The host began with a smile, but even his first few words carried a hint of sarcasm. Well, look who decided to show up tonight," he said with a grin. The audience laughed, though it wasn't exactly clear if they were laughing because they thought it was funny or simply because they felt they were supposed to. Keanu just gave a polite nod, smiling quietly, as though the comment had not bothered him. They talked for a moment about his upcoming project. The host asked a few questions, and Keanu gave his usual thoughtful, soft-spoken answers. The audience leaned in to listen, because Keanu was not someone who liked to talk just to impress. Every word seemed measured and meaningful. But soon, the tone of the host's questions began to shift. "Keanu," the host said loudly, "you've played so many different roles over the years. The chosen one, the assassin, even a time-traveling teenager. Do you ever look back and think, maybe I just got lucky? I mean, come on, some of those roles weren't exactly Shakespeare." The audience chuckled, some awkwardly, while others glanced at each other, unsure of how to react. The question wasn't completely unfair, but the way it was asked seemed more like a jab than genuine curiosity. Keanu, however, didn't flinch. He gave a small smile and answered softly, "I've been fortunate, yes. Every role gave me a chance to learn something new. I don't take any of it for granted." The host raised his eyebrows as if Keanu's humble response was too simple. He leaned forward and continued, "But really, don't you think people give you more credit than you deserve? You're quiet, you don't do flashy interviews, and half the time you look like you just walked out of a bus stop. Yet somehow you're called a superstar. Isn't that strange?" This time, the laughter from the audience was quieter. Some people shifted in their seats. They admired Keanu, and many of them felt that the host was crossing a line. But Keanu still remained calm. He didn't interrupt, didn't look upset, and didn't try to throw a clever comeback. Instead, he simply let the host finish and replied, "I think it's the people who decide who to support. I just try to do my work, live my life, and be grateful for what I have." For a moment, the host seemed almost frustrated that Keanu didn't rise to the bait. He leaned back in his chair and gave a small laugh. "You're too calm, man. Do you ever get angry? Or is that another role you're playing?" The audience gave a few nervous laughs again. Some people looked at Keanu as if silently supporting him. They wanted him to say something, but they also knew Keanu's way was never to fight with words or anger. Keanu, still wearing the same gentle smile, looked at the host and answered, "Anger doesn't help much. I've learned that. Life gives us enough challenges. I don't want to add to them by being angry when I don't need to." The audience clapped softly at his words, almost instinctively. It was unusual for such a quiet sentence to carry so much weight, but that was the effect Keanu had. He didn't speak loudly, didn't shout, but his words reached the heart. The host, however, wasn't ready to let go. He changed the subject slightly, but his tone stayed sharp. He brought up old tragedies from Keanu's life, things most people avoided mentioning in public because they knew how deeply personal and painful those memories were. "You've had a lot of losses in your life," the host said suddenly, "and you always seem sad in public. Do you think that's why people call you the sad meme guy? Maybe they just feel sorry for you." This time, the audience gasped softly. That question was too direct, too unkind. Many people frowned, and the energy in the room shifted. For the first time, the laughter disappeared completely. The host smirked as if expecting Keanu to stumble or get uncomfortable. But Keanu didn't. He took a small breath and simply nodded. "I've had my share of sadness, yes," he said quietly. "But I don't see it as something to be ashamed of. It's just part of being human." The studio was silent for a moment. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from boredom. It was the kind of silence that happens when people suddenly realize they are hearing something real and meaningful. The cameras caught the faces of the audience, some looked touched, some thoughtful, and others slightly uncomfortable because the host's comment had felt too cruel. But Keanu didn't look angry. His calmness was almost unsettling, but in a powerful way. He wasn't playing a role, and he wasn't pretending. He was simply himself, honest, thoughtful, and humble. By the end of part 1, the stage was set. The host's sarcasm had been met with Keanu's quiet strength. The audience, who had entered expecting to laugh at silly jokes and quick banter, began to sense they were witnessing something different. They leaned forward, waiting to see what would happen next, wondering how Keanu would continue to respond to a host who seemed determined to push him too far. And yet, Keanu's calm presence suggested that no matter how far the host went, the actor had something deeper to share, something that might turn the entire evening into a moment no one in that room would forget. The audience sat in silence for a moment after Keanu's calm response in the first part of the interview. They were beginning to feel the tension growing between the host and the guest. Most people had tuned in expecting light-hearted jokes, fun questions, and perhaps some entertaining stories from Keanu's long career. But instead, what they saw was a strange kind of battle, one man using sarcasm and mockery, and the other using calmness and humility. The host, however, didn't slow down. It was almost as if Keanu's polite answers made him even more restless. The host was famous for controlling the room, keeping the audience laughing, and always having the upper hand. But Keanu's stillness was making that difficult. The more Keanu stayed calm, the more the audience began to side with him quietly. The host leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Keanu," he said with a grin that didn't look entirely friendly, "you're an interesting guy. People think you're mysterious. But let's be real, you don't talk much, you don't show up at parties, and you always look, well, let's say a little too simple for Hollywood. Don't you think people love you only because they've created some strange idea of you, not because of who you really are?" The audience laughed weakly, but it wasn't the usual laugh that filled the studio during this show. It was hesitant, unsure. People didn't feel comfortable with the way the question was framed. Keanu, sitting calmly in his chair, tilted his head slightly, as if he was really considering the question. He didn't rush to answer, and the silence stretched for a few seconds. Finally, he replied softly, "Maybe people see something in me, maybe they don't. I don't try to control that. I just try to be myself. That's all I can do." The answer was simple, but it carried weight. The audience clapped again, louder this time, as if to show support. The host smiled, but it seemed more forced than genuine. Noticing the support from the audience, the host decided to try a different approach. He asked about one of Keanu's biggest films, The Matrix. At first, It seemed like a normal question, but it quickly turned into another jab. So, when you did The Matrix, did you even understand what was going on? Because honestly, half the people who watched it didn't. Maybe you were just reading the lines without knowing what they meant. This time, some in the audience laughed, but others shook their heads. It was clear to them that the host wasn't really interested in the movie. He was trying to make Keanu look foolish. Keanu gave a little chuckle, surprising everyone. "I'll admit," he said honestly, "some of the philosophy behind it was hard for me. But I tried to learn. I read what I could, I asked questions, and I trusted the directors. It wasn't easy, but I think that's what made the journey special. You don't always have to understand everything to give your best." The crowd clapped again, louder than before. The honesty in his words connected with them. They admired the way Keanu wasn't pretending to be smarter or more knowledgeable than he was. He was just being real, and that honesty made him even more likable. The host noticed the shift in the room. He frowned slightly, then quickly covered it with a laugh. He changed topics again, but this time his words carried more edge. "You know, people call you the nicest guy in Hollywood. That's your reputation. But I wonder, is that real? Or is it just good PR? Maybe you're just acting off the screen too." This comment made the audience react. A few gasped, and others murmured quietly. It was one thing to joke about movies or looks, but questioning someone's character so directly felt too harsh. Keanu, however, didn't look upset. He simply folded his hands together and looked at the host with the same calm expression. "I don't think kindness should be an act," he said softly. "It's just how I choose to live. I've seen enough in life to know that people are carrying battles we don't always see. If I can make that load lighter for someone, even for a moment, why wouldn't I?" The studio erupted in applause, this time long and strong. People were clapping not just out of politeness but because they truly felt inspired. Many of them nodded, some even looked emotional. It was clear that Keanu's words were touching something deep inside the audience. The host shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He had lost some of the control of the room. The audience wasn't laughing at his jokes as much anymore, and every time Keanu spoke, the room seemed to grow warmer, more supportive. Yet, the host still wasn't ready to back down. He leaned back and gave a smirk. "Well, if you're so nice, maybe you should run for president. Or maybe start a self-help group. You'd be perfect for that. Just sit quietly and let people feel better." The sarcasm in his tone was obvious, but instead of being insulted, Keanu smiled softly. "I'm not a leader," he said gently. "I'm just a person. But if people feel better after spending time with me, I think that's enough." The crowd clapped again, and this time many people stood for a brief moment before sitting back down. The host's eyes widened slightly. He had not expected the interview to turn in this direction. Usually, he was the one who left the audience laughing and cheering at his cleverness. But now, it was Keanu's quiet dignity that had captured their hearts. As the interview went on, the tension only grew more visible. The host kept trying to steer the conversation back to humor, back to his usual style of mocking banter, but the audience wasn't with him anymore. They were leaning toward Keanu, waiting for his thoughtful replies, clapping at his humility, and even cheering when he gave simple answers filled with wisdom. At one point, the host sighed dramatically and said, "You're impossible to tease, Keanu. Don't you ever want to fight back? Don't you ever want to just snap at someone?" Keanu looked at him for a long moment and then gave a small smile. "Fighting back doesn't always make things better. Sometimes silence says more than words. And sometimes kindness changes more than anger." The audience erupted again in applause, louder than ever before. Some people whistled, others shouted his name, and the host was forced to sit back and let the noise die down. For the first time in his career, he was losing the spotlight on his own stage. By the end of the segment, the mood in the room had shifted completely. What had started as a playful, sarcastic interview had turned into something else, something unexpected. The audience wasn't just watching a celebrity talk about movies. They were watching a man handle rudeness with grace, cruelty with kindness, and mockery with wisdom. And in doing so, Keanu was winning their respect in a way that left everyone stunned. As the cameras kept rolling, the tension between the host and Keanu was obvious. The host's jokes were falling flat, and Keanu's simple, heartfelt answers were lifting the atmosphere. The audience could feel that something powerful was building, and they were eager to see what would happen next. The studio lights shone brightly as the interview carried on, but the mood in the room was no longer the same as it had been at the start. At first, the audience had laughed along with the host's jokes, even when they felt slightly uncomfortable. But now, after watching Keanu's calmness and hearing his thoughtful words, the atmosphere had shifted. The audience wasn't laughing at the sarcasm anymore. Instead, they were leaning in, waiting for every word that Keanu might say. It was as if everyone knew something important was about to happen. The host, on the other hand, seemed to grow restless. His usual rhythm was broken. Normally, he would poke fun at a guest, and the guest would laugh nervously or try to joke back, and the crowd would roar. That was the formula that had kept his show popular for years. But this time, it wasn't working. The more he pushed, the more Keanu responded with calm wisdom, and the more the audience clapped for him. Desperate to take control again, the host leaned forward and asked a question that made everyone hold their breath. "Keanu," he said loudly, "let me ask you this. People call you the nicest guy in Hollywood. But honestly, isn't it exhausting? Don't you ever get tired of pretending to be so humble? Come on, drop the act. Show us the real you." The words hung in the air. The audience gasped softly. This wasn't playful teasing anymore, it sounded almost like an accusation. Everyone's eyes turned to Keanu, waiting to see how he would respond. A lesser person might have become defensive, angry, or even walked off the stage. But Keanu sat still, his face calm, his posture relaxed. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he allowed the silence to stretch. The studio grew so quiet that even the faint hum of the cameras could be heard. The host shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly not expecting this pause. Finally, Keanu lifted his gaze, looked directly at the host, and began to speak in a soft but steady voice. "You want to see the real me," he said gently. "This is the real me. I'm not pretending. I've lived through things that taught me to value kindness. I've seen loss. I've seen how fragile life can be. And when you go through that, you realize being cruel, being arrogant, it doesn't add anything to the world. But kindness does. Even a small act can make someone's day better. That's why I try. Not because it's an act, but because I've learned that life is too short to do otherwise." The studio fell silent. No one moved, no one spoke. The host blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected depth of Keanu's response. He had been hoping for irritation or sarcasm, something he could twist into humor. But instead, Keanu had answered with honesty and vulnerability. Keanu continued, his voice still calm but carrying more weight now. "We don't know what people are carrying. The person next to you, the stranger you meet on the street, they might be fighting a battle you'll never see. So, if I can be gentle, if I can be respectful, why wouldn't I? That's not a performance. That's just living." The audience erupted in applause, long and loud. Some even stood to their feet, clapping passionately. The host's face turned red. He gave a small, forced smile, but it was clear he felt the shift in the room. He was losing his grip on the show, and Keanu had taken control without ever raising his voice. When the applause died down, Keanu leaned back in his chair, his expression still composed. He wasn't trying to win anything. He wasn't trying to make himself look good. He was simply sharing the truth, and that truth resonated with every person in the room. The host, embarrassed, tried to laugh it off. "Wow, Keanu, you've turned my comedy show into a philosophy lecture," he joked. But his voice didn't carry the same confidence as before. The audience didn't laugh the way he expected. Instead, they clapped again, as if to support Keanu's words once more. The cameras zoomed in on Keanu's face. There was no anger there, no sign of insult. Only calmness, a quiet strength that seemed to glow from within. And then he added one more sentence, a sentence that would be replayed across television screens and social media for weeks to come. He said, "Being kind is not weakness. It's strength. Because it's easier to be cruel. It takes more to stay gentle in a world that isn't always gentle back." The moment those words left his lips, the audience erupted louder than before. People cheered, clapped, and whistled. Some had tears in their eyes. The entire energy of the room had changed. What had begun as an awkward interview filled with sarcasm had transformed into something unforgettable, a lesson in dignity and humanity. The host sat back in his chair, momentarily speechless. For once, he had nothing clever to say. The silence in his response was louder than any joke he might have made. He looked down at his notes, shuffled his papers, and tried to regain control, but the truth was clear to everyone watching: Keanu had already won the room. For the audience, this wasn't just entertainment anymore. It felt like they had witnessed something rare. They had seen a celebrity not as a character on screen, but as a human being who carried wisdom from real experiences. People in the audience whispered to one another, nodding their heads, smiling at Keanu, their respect for him growing stronger by the second. The cameras shifted to capture the crowd, and the expressions told the whole story: admiration, inspiration, and even a sense of relief that someone in Hollywood could be so genuine. Meanwhile, Keanu remained as humble as ever. He didn't smile proudly, he didn't try to bask in the applause. Instead, he gave a small nod to the audience, almost as if to thank them for listening, and then folded his hands on his lap quietly. The host cleared his throat and attempted to move the conversation forward. "Well," he said awkwardly, "I think we've all learned a little life lesson tonight, huh?" The audience chuckled politely, but it was clear that no one was laughing with him. They were still thinking about Keanu's words. At that moment, the cameras caught a close-up of the host's face. His confident smirk was gone, replaced with something uncertain. For years, he had been the one in control, the one who dictated how the show flowed. But tonight, in front of millions of viewers, his power had been quietly taken from him, not by force, not by anger, but by kindness and truth. And the audience knew it. They had just witnessed something they would talk about for a long time. A moment where a man known for his humility and gentle nature stood strong without ever raising his voice, leaving not only the host but also everyone in the room speechless. By the time the commercial break was called, the audience was still buzzing. People whispered to each other, some wiping their eyes, others shaking their heads in amazement. What they had just seen wasn't the usual late-night comedy. It was something far more powerful. And deep down, they knew the best part was still to come. The moment the cameras cut to commercial, the studio felt different. The energy in the room had changed completely. Audience members whispered excitedly to one another, some replaying Keanu's words in their heads, others shaking their heads at how bold the host had been earlier. The host, usually so confident, leaned back in his chair, fidgeting with his papers, clearly uneasy. He had been on television for years and thought he had seen it all, but never before had a guest turned the mood of his own show around so completely. When the cameras returned and the bright red light signaled that they were live again, the host tried to start fresh. He forced a wide smile and introduced the next segment, pretending as though nothing unusual had happened. "Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We're here with the one and only Keanu Reeves," he said, clapping loudly. The audience clapped too, but their claps were more for Keanu than for the host. Keanu sat calmly, hands folded in his lap, his expression thoughtful. He wasn't trying to outshine anyone, but the way he carried himself made him stand out. The host leaned forward again, clearly trying to take back control of the interview. "So, Keanu," he said with a forced laugh, "let's lighten things up, huh? Enough of the serious stuff. People at home want to laugh. They don't want to hear you talk about kindness and all that. So tell me, have you ever done something completely ridiculous? Something embarrassing we can all laugh at?" The host grinned, waiting for the audience to join him. A few chuckled politely, but most sat quietly, waiting for Keanu's reply. Keanu thought for a moment, then gave a small smile. "I've made plenty of mistakes," he admitted. "But I don't really see them as things to laugh at. They're just moments I learned from." The host raised his eyebrows, clearly disappointed. He leaned back and said, "Come on, don't tell me you're perfect. Everyone's got embarrassing stories. Maybe you just don't have the personality for comedy." This time, the audience didn't laugh at all. Instead, some of them frowned. The host's words sounded more like an insult than a joke. The cameras captured faces in the crowd: folded arms, raised eyebrows, quiet stares. The host could feel the room slipping away from him again. Keanu, however, smiled gently. "I don't think life is about trying to be funny," he said softly. "But it's also not about being perfect. We're all imperfect. That's what makes us human. I just try to live with respect for others, even when it's hard." The audience erupted in applause again, longer and louder. Some people even stood briefly before sitting down, clapping with enthusiasm. Keanu's words weren't dramatic or shouted, they were calm and quiet. But they carried truth, and that truth touched everyone listening. The host tried to speak over the applause. all right, he said, raising his hands, "settle down. You'd think we were in church or something." The audience laughed lightly at that, but they were still clearly on Keanu's side. The tension between the host and Keanu became more obvious. The host's jokes, once the highlight of his show, were now falling flat. Every time he tried to cut Keanu down, the audience pushed back with silence or by cheering louder for Keanu. The more this happened, the more uncomfortable the host grew. At one point, the host sighed and asked bluntly, "Why do people take you so seriously? You're just an actor. You read lines someone else writes. You fight with stunt doubles. What makes your words matter more than anyone else's?" The question was sharp, almost cruel, and the studio fell into stunned silence. The cameras zoomed in on Keanu. The audience held their breath. Everyone waited to see what he would say. Keanu sat still for a moment, then leaned forward slightly. His voice was soft, but it carried clearly across the room. "You're right," he said gently. "I'm just an actor. I'm not a doctor, not a scientist, not a leader. But I am a person. And being a person means I've lived, I've struggled, I've lost, and I've learned. Those experiences, those are not lines someone gave me. They are real. And if sharing what I've learned helps someone else, even in a small way, then maybe that matters." The audience clapped again, many of them cheering. Some were visibly moved, their eyes shining. The host opened his mouth, then closed it again, unable to find a quick comeback. For once, the man who was famous for never being at a loss for words had nothing to say. Keanu continued, still calm, still composed. "It's not about me being an actor. It's about me being human. We all have something to share. We all have ways to lift each other up. Sometimes it just takes a moment of listening, instead of trying to laugh at someone." The words hit hard. The studio was completely silent for a moment, the weight of his statement filling the air. Then the silence broke with thunderous applause. The audience stood up, clapping and cheering, louder than they had all evening. The host sat frozen in his chair, watching as his own audience gave a standing ovation to his guest. The camera panned across the crowd, smiling faces, clapping hands, even a few people wiping tears from their eyes. It was no longer just a talk show interview. It was a lesson, a reminder of what mattered in life. And it came from a man who had been mocked just minutes earlier. The host finally forced a smile, but his eyes showed defeat. He picked up his mug, took a sip of water, and tried to move the show along. But it was clear to everyone watching, Keanu had won not by trying to win, but by staying true to himself. The energy in the studio didn't die down even as the conversation shifted. Every time Keanu spoke, the audience leaned in. Every time the host tried to make a joke, it felt hollow. The control was gone, and the balance of power had shifted. As the segment drew to a close, Keanu leaned back and looked around the studio. His eyes were calm, but there was also a softness in them, as if he truly cared for every single person watching. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't insulted anyone, but he had spoken truths that touched hearts. The host tried to end on a lighter note. "Well," he said with a stiff smile, "this interview didn't exactly go how I planned, but I guess that's showbiz." Keanu Reeves, everybody. The audience exploded in applause once more, their cheers echoing around the studio. The camera zoomed in on Keanu as he gave a small bow, a quiet thank you to the crowd. He hadn't needed flashy words, anger, or arrogance. He had simply been himself, and that was enough to leave the entire audience speechless. Behind the scenes, the producers exchanged glances. They knew this interview would go viral. Clips of Keanu's calm replies, his heartfelt words, and the standing ovation would be replayed everywhere. The host might have been embarrassed, but for Keanu, this was just another example of his quiet strength. And the night wasn't even over. The audience knew they had witnessed something rare, but they didn't yet realize how deeply Keanu's final words would stay with them, long after the cameras stopped rolling. The studio was buzzing with energy after the standing ovation. The cameras had captured every moment, and the audience knew they were part of something unforgettable. Keanu Reeves had not raised his voice once, had not insulted the host, yet he had completely turned the room around. The host, who had entered the evening with confidence and sharp humor, now looked unsettled, his usual control slipping through his fingers. The interview that was supposed to showcase his cleverness had instead revealed something deeper, the quiet power of humility. As the show neared its closing segment, the host tried one last time to steer things back toward humor. He adjusted his tie, gave a tight smile, and said, "Well, Keanu, you've given us all a lot to think about tonight. But, you know, this is a comedy show, not a therapy session. Maybe we should end with a joke. Got one for us?" The audience gave a few awkward laughs, but they weren't with him. They wanted to hear more from Keanu, not a forced joke. Keanu, however, didn't laugh at the comment. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his hands resting calmly on his knees, and he spoke once more. "I don't have a joke," he said gently, "but I do have something to share. We live in a world where people are quick to judge, quick to mock, quick to tear others down. But I believe we can do better. We can listen more. We can be kinder. And sometimes, even in places where we expect laughter, we can still learn something that stays with us longer than a joke ever will." The studio fell silent again. Every pair of eyes was on him. The host opened his mouth as if to interrupt, but no words came out. Keanu's voice carried across the stage, soft yet powerful, holding everyone's attention without effort. He continued, "I'm not here to pretend I have all the answers. I'm not here to tell anyone how to live. But I know what I've seen. I've seen people struggling quietly, carrying pain no one else notices. And I've learned that one kind word, One act of respect can sometimes change a person's entire day. Maybe even their life. That's not comedy, but it is real. The audience broke into applause again, this time even louder than before. Many people rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. The sound filled the studio, echoing against the walls. The host sat frozen, his smile fading as he realized the show was no longer his. Keanu gave a small nod to the crowd, his expression humble as ever. He wasn't basking in the applause, wasn't seeking attention. He was simply thankful. And that sincerity was what made the moment so powerful. After the applause calmed down, Keanu added quietly, "We may not remember every joke we hear, but we always remember how people made us feel. And I hope, if nothing else, we leave here tonight remembering that kindness is worth more than cleverness." That single sentence seemed to sink into everyone's hearts. The audience responded with another wave of clapping, cheers, and whistles. People looked around at each other, nodding, smiling, and even wiping away tears. It wasn't just a television interview anymore, it felt like a life lesson that people had been waiting to hear. The host, visibly uncomfortable, cleared his throat. He had built his career on quick comebacks, but he had none left. For the first time in a long time, he was quiet. The silence from him was louder than anything he could have said. It was clear he knew he had gone too far, and now the entire world had seen it. The closing music of the show began to play softly in the background. The host forced a smile, trying to salvage his dignity. "Well, ladies and gentlemen," he said, "that's all the time we have for tonight. Keanu Reeves, everyone." The audience roared with applause once more, louder than at any point in the show. People stood up, clapping and cheering with full hearts. Some even shouted, "We love you, Keanu." Their voices echoed across the studio. The cameras zoomed in on Keanu one last time. He bowed his head slightly, gave a small wave, and whispered, "Thank you." The show ended, but the story was just beginning. Within hours, clips of the interview began spreading across social media. Short videos of Keanu's calm responses and his powerful words about kindness went viral. Millions of people around the world watched, shared, and commented. Headlines appeared everywhere: "Keanu Reeves silences rude talk show host with wisdom," "Audience stunned by Keanu's grace under pressure," and "The day Keanu Reeves taught us all a lesson in humanity." People praised him not just for his acting, but for his character. Many said the interview reminded them that true strength doesn't come from shouting or insulting, it comes from staying calm, being genuine, and speaking from the heart. Viewers who had never cared much for late-night shows found themselves replaying the clips again and again, moved by the simplicity and honesty of Keanu's words. Meanwhile, the host faced harsh criticism. Fans flooded social media, calling him out for his disrespectful questions. Some demanded that he apologize, others said the show would never be the same. Eventually, the host released a statement, saying he had only meant to joke and that he regretted if his words hurt anyone. But by then, the focus had already shifted. The world wasn't talking about the host anymore. They were talking about Keanu Reeves and how he had once again proven why he was one of the most respected figures in Hollywood. In the days that followed, the interview was replayed on news channels, discussed in talk shows, and written about in magazines. Teachers showed it to their students as an example of grace under pressure. Parents shared it with their children as a lesson in humility. It became more than just a viral clip, it became a reminder that kindness is powerful, and dignity can silence even the loudest voices. And through it all, Keanu remained the same. He didn't boast about the moment, didn't use it for publicity. When asked about it later in another interview, he simply smiled and said, "I just tried to be myself." That humility only made people admire him more. In a world full of noise, Keanu Reeves had spoken softly, and everyone had listened. He hadn't planned it, hadn't rehearsed it, but his words had left a lasting impact. The audience who had been there that night never forgot the experience. Many of them said it was the most meaningful moment they had ever witnessed in a television studio. They had come expecting laughter, but they left with something much more valuable, a lesson they could carry into their own lives. As for the host, his reputation was never quite the same. But perhaps even he had learned something from that night. Sometimes, the sharpest joke is no match for the quiet truth spoken with sincerity. And so, the story of that evening lived on. The night when Keanu Reeves confronted a rude talk show host not with anger, not with insults, but with kindness and wisdom that left an entire audience, and eventually the whole world, speechless.